This is TWiT.
For the first time since 2002, Apple yesterday issued a press release to investors where it revised its guidance for the first 2019 quarter, effectively lowering it below the original estimate. And because this is Apple we're talking about here, everyone, including the market, lost its ever-loving mind. Joining us to help everyone take a deep breath and calm down a little bit is Rene Ritchie from iMore. Megan's over there meditating. Have you meditated around this yet, Rene?
Yeah, I am entirely in a Megan-like Zen state. And just good air in, bad Twitter out.
Right.
I don't,
Block bad, harness good.
I don't own any Apple stock, by the way. So just so we know,
But it's Apple we're talking about here. So the first news hit of this yesterday. It seemed like everybody was given their quick, rapid succession hot takes almost immediately. What was your initial take?
Oh, just for that was amazing because everybody used every pet peeve or personal gripe. They suddenly had a way to justify it. It's like, I knew Apple jettisoning the floppy drive in the original iMac was going to come back and bite them, and it finally has. And it was just, it must have been so cathartic. It was quasi-beautiful, quasi-terrifying to watch.
So obviously, we wake up this morning, we kind of see the effects on the stock. The stock has taken a pretty sizable hit. And you have to admit, like, this is a really big deal for Apple. Obviously, the company itself isn't on fire, but this is one of Apple's biggest disappointments in the modern iPhone era that we can talk about. Where is all of this trouble coming from? Apple made a big point about this being largely around their business in China. What's the bottom line there?
So there are a lot of symptoms, and I think there's a root cause to all of it. The symptoms are everything from what Apple said, which is China. There was almost like a perfect negative storm in China where everything from the trade and tariff problems that these two authoritarian and unpredictable governments are suddenly finding themselves in, to the Chinese economy going down, to some spirit of nationalism in China, and very strong competitors like Huawei who are in the market. There's also, to some extent, people use WeChat and say that's the platform in China, and it makes it easier to switch between devices and between manufacturers. Although Apple services numbers were up and their install base was up, which means that Apple does enjoy, I think, a little more stickiness than your average brand does in China. But that's sort of the China story. And then Tim Cook also said there was some softness in upgrades in North America, and that he attributed in part to the iPhone battery replacement program. iPhone battery awareness was very low and price was high previously, but as of 2018, awareness went through the roof and prices went right to the bottom, and a lot of people got a battery replacement instead of buying a new iPhone. And then you could throw in high iPhone prices for the XS. Also, some people who just don't want to give up their home button or are just happy to ride it out. There's no more cell phone companies subsidizing prices. So the sticker shock is much bigger than it has ever been before. And you had almost like another perfect little storm in North America. But I think both of those things, like I said, are symptoms. And the actual thing is that we've reached the stage of smartphones where almost everybody who wants one has one and is relatively happy with the one that they have.
Yeah.
So you bring up this WeChat thing, which is so interesting to me. So what you're saying is because most people communicate on WeChat, then which is cross-platform, it's very easy to go back and forth. And so to switch from an iPhone to an Android phone is not as difficult. I mean, is that, like you mentioned that first, is that really, I mean, more weighted in this than the other things? Because, I mean, that's what I always think anecdotally, like I could never switch to an Android because of iMessage. But is that really true?
Yeah, to a certain extent. For example, people in China use WeChat for everything. It is their iMessage. It is their Apple or Google Pay. They use it for every transaction, for every interaction. And that means that if you get a different phone, whether you switch from ZTE to Huawei or you switch from Apple to another manufacturer, your instance of WeChat just goes with you. So the barrier to switching is much less than it is in a country where the rest of the world is still iOS versus Android and iMessage and WhatsApp. There are a lot more barriers, like everything you bought on Google Play versus everything you bought on the App Store. And the Chinese economy is just not that tied to a platform. But again, I would be more worried, but Apple's number for services is growing. And that, I think, is a counterindication. And the number of installed units is growing. So I think Apple first is seen as a luxury brand. You get face, you get esteem for owning Apple. But also, I think Apple is getting some buy-in to their services, which previously might not have been the case.
Now, when I look at Apple's struggles in China, which, like we've discussed, was a large part of Tim Cook's kind of write-up around why they were lowering these expectations. It's striking to me that Apple as a company has these challenges, but that this could be a greater warning for a whole lot of other companies, right? Could this be the interpretation that if Apple is having a challenge in China, where obviously there's a huge market there to be tapped into, that everybody else should also be really concerned about this if Apple can't make it work?
To some extent, yeah. I mean, we've already seen a big shakeout in phones. It got to the point where only Apple and Samsung really make money in smartphones. There are some people who make a little bit of money, but the vast majority of money is made by Apple first and then Samsung, and everyone else either spent other money to subsidize their entry into the market, like Microsoft using Windows and Office profits for a long time with Windows Mobile, or they folded, like what happened with Palm and the troubles that Nokia and BlackBerry have gone through. So it has never been a high profit business, and that's always made it slightly dangerous. But when you look at the numbers, like Apple is down, Samsung is probably going to be down as well. It does show that it's no longer sort of the fire everything, growth, huge success, we're making more money than oil companies story that it was for a while in the past.
So I've heard some people online just basically say it's as simple as this, and you brought this up a little bit too. They raised the price of all the phones. It's very high, and fewer people bought them. It's basic economics. What's the surprise? Talk about that take.
Yeah, I think that's another case of people taking what they feel and then sorting facts to support that. And I think it's a lot more nuanced than that. It's the same as the WeChat story. There's all sorts of things. Some people are still saying, hey, it's the headphone jack, man. If they hadn't got rid of the headphone jack, they'd be flying high. So it's whatever personally bugs you. And if you're offended by higher prices, and I think there's certainly a case to be made that they did overprice all of these phones, I think that's true. But I don't know if that's an exact causation effect here. Because for a lot of people, the prices are, especially in the US, they can be amortized over subscription programs. Internationally, it's been very bad because the US dollar is so strong. So prices in Canada, the UK, other countries are astronomically higher. And that Apple did mention, they did mention the foreign exchange was a huge factor to them. Overall, Apple is in a bit of a sticky situation there because Apple is not making iPhones more expensive. Apple is making more expensive iPhones. Everything from the OLED screens to the true depth camera modules are much more expensive than the old LCD screens, the old Touch ID, the old front-facing cameras. There also components have gone up substantially over the last few years, and Apple's prepaid for a lot of those. But when the prepay runs out, they have to start paying again, and their prices go up. And if you look at what Apple's guided, it's also guided margins down, and margins are down about 2% since the height of the Steve Jobs era. Which some people are like, oh, Tim Cook just wants to milk all the profits out of the industry at the expense of market. He is making less profit. He's making much bigger volume, but he's making less profit than Steve Jobs did historically. So I think that is a factor. It's absolutely a factor. Sticker shock is real, but I think it's again an example of the problem of just everybody. If you're still desperate for an iPhone, you could probably justify it. But if your iPhone is pretty good, if you're pretty happy, then it's harder to say I'm going to pay $1,000 for another iPhone.
Yeah, I think that's a really big consideration, and not just for Apple, Apple's iPhones, but phones in general. We've gotten to this point where things are like it's such a commodity at this point. Like that your phone is probably going to be good enough to do all of the things. 5 years ago, you could name off the top of your head all the ways that your phone sucks, but now when you get it, yes, it's really good, and not just for that year. It's good for 2 years, 3 years, and it becomes more and more difficult to justify not only replacing it, but replacing it with the new normal of the price point of $1,000. And so those factors combined, that's a pretty potent thing to go up against.
We're not used to the price of technology going up. We've all lived in an era where technology was invented and is now quickly growing, and we're used to technology forcing prices down. Our house prices don't go down. Our car prices don't always go down. We pay incredible amounts of money for bottles of water and for lattes, but we're not used to paying a lot for technology. And as it matures, those market conditions are going to be different, and it's not going to continue to race down. And we're going to have to face either what we consider to be a good enough phone or what we're willing to pay to be a good enough phone, which isn't the device that most of us use for like 8 hours a day, every day, all year, compared to a lot of other things we pay a lot of money for.
Yeah.
So I want to get back to all of this analyst doom and gloom and, the stock market. When people come out with these things that aren't based on fact, I'm not talking about just random people twittering or tweeting, but but just people like true analysts that are saying these things that are not based on fact. How is that not illegal market manipulation?
I think it really should be. I mean, we had Kramer has admitted to it in the past that if he hasn't made his shorts, he calls up, starts a rumor. Apple publications are happy, or previously BlackBerry publications were happy to jump on it. It would drive down the stock price. He'd short and he'd make his quarter. And like he said that on tape, it's on YouTube. You can go look at it. And I don't know why that's not investigated. I don't know why the funds aren't investigated, but it does create problems because this quarter we saw people say that Apple's sales were down. And it's gotten to the point where they didn't get believed automatically. Last year, there was panic and it turned out to be wrong. And for quarter after quarter before that, for years and years, there were, Verizon's not going to take the iPhone. The iPhone is not down. Apple's not going to make their numbers. The supply, and it was never true. And now finally it's true and nobody believed it. And that hurts the investors as much as the fake stories of Apple being under beleaguered or sieged hurt them previously.
So at this point, obviously, there's going to be a lot of eyeballs on Apple to see like what they can do to right the ship if it needs righting. What do you believe? What is the best approach for Apple at this stage of the game?
One of the biggest factors, I think, is that the iPhone is a absolutely huge distortion. It destroys any or most rational takes on Apple because the iPhone makes so much money. It makes more money than companies that are in control of very scarce fossil fuel resources. And when you start to look at Apple, like what's the next iPhone, it's unclear there is a next iPhone for Apple or for anybody, like until the next miraculous wearable technology or cybernetic implants become something that everybody simply has to have. There's just not going to be another iPhone. But if you take the iPhone away and you look at the other businesses, you look at everything from Mac to iPad to Apple Watch to AirPods to services, there's a lot of fundamentally really good, really high-performing businesses there. And I think if you look at Apple's behavior over the last 4 or 5 years, they weren't fooled by their own success. They knew that peak iPhone was coming, and they realized that once you can't sell iPhones anymore, you have to sell things to people who have iPhones. And that's why we see AirPods and Apple Watch, I think, taking off, and why Apple is making a bigger play into services. And all of those businesses, I think Cook said overall they were up 19%, and they're having record services business, even in China and in other parts of the world. And even with this huge hit, this is still going to be the second best quarter in the history of Apple, which has a history of really, really good quarters. Mm-hmm. So I think as long as they're not deluded into thinking they have to necessarily fix iPhone beyond the way a company can legitimately fix it, if they keep investing in everything else that the iPhone enables, then it may not be the Taylor Swift of consumer electronics anymore, but it'll be a bunch of really good-sized rock bands for their future.
Well, Rene Ritchie, it's always awesome to get you on. We appreciate you hopping on to give us your take on this big Apple news. Rene Ritchie, iMore.com. Thanks, man. Happy New Year.
Thank you so much. Happy New Year.
We'll talk to you soon. Take care, Rene.